No. Interspecies reviewers? Maybe not right now. No. I don't really want to do anything with Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, or Dragon Ball. So no shonen at all. No, not even Yu-Gi-Oh! No, no, no. The original shonen from 1991. Okay. But what the heck is this? Okay, that makes sense. You know, it's interesting when someone comes across a regional variant of something that they are most commonly familiar with. For example, here are my Japanese copies of Super Mario Brothers and Zelda, and here's the American versions. In terms of reading material, I have a few Japanese books and manga collections, but then there are these. I have my original shonen from 1991, straight from Japan, and then there's this manga, which isn't even Japanese, it's Korean. So, what's the story behind this? Well, for that, we have to go all the way back to the end of World War II. I'm sorry. It was 1945. Japan had surrendered to the U.S. forces following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This surrender would not only end World War II, but would also end Japan's 35-year rule over Korea, which had been established since 1910 after Japan ran out the Russians from the peninsula in 1905. Japan, however, wouldn't recognize South Korea as its own country until 1965. This is not what we're going to be focused on, however. What I want to focus on is the laws that the newly formed South Korean government enacted in regards to their former ruler and their culture coming into their country. Essentially, following many disputes between the two countries, laws were put in place to ban any mention of Japanese culture within South Korea, mainly in regards to media. Enacted in 1945, the law for punishing anti-national deeds was passed and enacted, with later revisions and amending laws being passed later on. What this meant was that no Japanese media was able to be imported or broadcast in South Korea for a good chunk of the 20th century, meaning no Japanese films, TV shows, dramas, books, music, and the three most important things to this series: no anime, no manga, and no video games. Or so they said. As the decades passed since the law was enacted, South Korean entertainment had to grow with the means of replicating what Japan had been doing. So, in a way, creative forces in South Korea were kind of bending around the rules to create their own versions of Japanese entertainment. Thus, case in point. With manga getting the treatment first starting in 1948 and only growing in popularity from then on, with the peak point being in the 1960s when various Korean manga, or manhwa, were being produced to cover a variety of demographics and genres. Around the same time in the 1960s, South Korea also began producing their own animated films to compete with Japan's anime library of that time, with the South Korean adaptation of The Ant and the Grasshopper being the first in 1967. The first South Korean original animated series would later be released on Korean television in 1987, with Dooley the Little Dinosaur, lasting 2 seasons and rerunning until 1993. Alright, so that was a basic understanding of how they dealt with anime and, well, where this manga came from. But here's a funny notion. how did they handle the rise of video games when that industry started taking off in the 70s and 80s? Well, it's humorously interesting. In the 1970s, South Korean companies like Samsung and LG would release their own Pong clone consoles out on the market, descripting them as TV games. In the mid-1980s, electronics company Daewoo would release their own version of the popular 80s computer MSX onto the market as the Zemix. On top of all of that, though, in the 1980s, Famicom consoles would start to come into their own as markets would become oversaturated with them by the end of the decade. In an odd twist of events, though, by the late 1980s, Nintendo and Sega were able to tiptoe their way into the Korean market via the use of proxy and licensing. Yep, as a way of swinging around the law, Nintendo and Sega partnered up with Korean manufacturers and electronics companies to ensure that their systems were able to sell in the South Korean market. Nintendo would partner up with Hyundai, a Korean manufacturer, in 1989 to release the Famicom, or NES, in South Korea as the Hyundai Comboy, with the follow-up systems like the Super Famicom or SNES, Game Boy, and N64 being released as the Super Comboy, Comboy Mini, and Comboy 64 in 1992, 1990, and 1997 respectively. The Comboy 64 would also be Nintendo's last console to be released by Hyundai, but we'll get into the reason why in a little bit. As for Sega, well, their Korean distribution partner might come as an absolute shock to you. Yeah. In an interesting turn of events, Sega would partner up with Samsung to release their consoles in South Korea, kicking off with the release of the Game Boy, or Master System, in 1989. Sega and Samsung would later go on to release the Mega Drive, or Genesis, along with the later add-ons, the Game Gear, and finally the Saturn as the Super Game Boy, Handy Game Boy, and the Samsung Saturn from 1990 to 1997. With the Samsung Saturn being a flop, Sega and Samsung decided to split ways around the same time Nintendo split from Hyundai. So, why did Nintendo and Sega split from their respective distributors of the region? Well, it came down to two factors. One, 1997 would end up being a time of financial hardship for the Asian markets due to the Asian financial crisis caused by a bubbling economy. Think of it in a way as a version of the dot-com bubble America went through in the late 90s and early 2000s. This crisis caused a meltdown of the Asian economies for South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia that wouldn't fully recover until 2 years later in 1999. Secondly, the South Korean government was starting to pull back on some of those conditions of the anti-Japanese media law by 1998. This pullback, though, was at first only for mangas and films that were co-productions between the two countries. Video games and anime wouldn't be unbanned until 2004. With the only laws still intact as of the writing and recording of this episode being on the broadcasting of Japanese dramas and music. Daewon would handle the South Korean release of the GameCube in 2003, being one of the last South Korean companies to handle distribution for the Big N, with the Wii being Nintendo's first distribution to South Korea in 2008, 4 years after the restrictions of Japanese game companies was lifted, competing against the Sony PS3, which was released a year prior, and Microsoft's Xbox 360, which was released in 2006 in the region. So, why did I just spend all of this time talking about these laws and the ways both Korean and Japanese entertainment had to go around them? I honestly can't remember. Oh wait, I don't remember. Because it's interesting. Yeah, something like this is actually fascinating every once in a while to look into. I mean, come on. Granted, yeah, the rules were kind of made for a fucked up reason, but in the end, it's still a pretty fascinating tale of just a moment in history when I actually think I lost my point to all this. I lost the point to all of this. I can't believe it. I guess it's just weird. It's just a weird facet of technological history. Hell, not even technological history. It's just a weird fact about Japanese and Korean history. It's just weird. And I think that's what I like about it. I spent almost a decade and a half looking into Japanese history and culture. Especially pop culture. But just learning about this alone has got to be one of the most fascinating things I think I'd ever dug into. Just the idea that because of situations that happened prior to World War II, that South Korea would essentially enact a law that were banned. This, leading to this, is just interesting to me. And I think it should be interesting to a lot of people. Yeah, this is like a weird nugget of history. To think that for a good chunk of the 20th century, one country just outright banned the media of another country. And in the end, they had to rely on their own intuition to, well, essentially copy it and make their own. And you have to kind of give them credit for that. And then at the same time, you also have to kind of give credit to companies like Sega and Nintendo for finding ways to get around those rules by essentially loopholes. And the fact that they were still able to sell their consoles in Korea just through those means alone. Again, that's something that just has to be applauded. And yeah, I am going to applaud that. This has been an overall interesting subject to look into, and I'm kind of glad I did. Because sometimes it could be the things you don't really think about that'll make you the most fascinated in wanting to learn more about it. Ah, fuck me, I'm gonna have to put away all these mangas, ain't I? Son of a bitch!
Kokoro